Well, hi there. So in this video, we're going to talk about our third market structure, which is called oligopoly. Oligopoly. Few sellers. That's all it means. So let's get started. Okay, so the first portion here about oligopoly just kind of gives you the key traits. And there are really just two key traits to understanding oligopoly. Now, I mentioned in the intro that olig means few and poly means sellers. So there are few sellers. When we say few, we mean a small number, usually less than 10. And these typically happen where there's a large barrier to entry and where each of the firms that is there has some kind of market power. What we mean by market power is that they're kind of able to move the market a little bit, right? Whereas when think about perfect competition, you had thousands of firms. Each one is too small to be able to affect the price or the quantity in the market really in a substantial way. But in this market, you have a few enough of them that if one of them decides to do something, it's going to change the rest of the market. Now, as a result, we call this interdependence, right? And that's an outgrowth of having a small number of firms. Interdependence means that the outcome of one firm and the decisions of one firm can affect the outcomes and the decisions of the other firms, that they are interdependent. They depend on one another. And so we kind of have a way of thinking about whether something is an oligopoly by using something called a measure of market power. And there are two ways or measures that we usually can tell that something is truly an oligopoly. Because you could imagine that if you had maybe a market with, say, 10,000 firms, but of those 10,000 firms, only 4 of them controlled 97% of the market. Well, yeah, you have 10,000 companies, but really 4 of them control 97% of the market. So there's a simple math problem way that we can actually kind of calculate and see, is this truly an oligopoly? Because you're often going to have a scenario where for oligopolies where you have tons and tons of firms, but a whole lot of them don't really do anything. And maybe there's only 3 or 4 companies that are really, really big players. So the first measure of market power, it's the simplest one, is called the 4-firm concentration ratio. And that's just the sum of the 4 biggest firms' market shares. So what I've actually got here for you is the most recent data that I could find about the number of subscribers for various different types of streaming services, Netflix, Prime, Plus, so forth. And these are obviously, some of these are duplicated subscribers in that sense, but the total amount of subscribers in the market is, say, 350 million. And each of these is in millions as well. And we would say that the market share, therefore, of the 350 is, say, 20%, 20%, 15, 15, 12, and 18. And so this tells us, if we kind of summed up the 4 biggest ones, and again, others is 60 and 18%. So I'm ruling out the others because this is actually a zillion different little small streaming services. We would say 20 plus 20 plus 15 plus 15 equals 40 plus 30 is 70. And that tells me anything usually above, usually 50 or 60 is a good indication that the market's pretty concentrated. So this is pretty much an oligopoly is what I would say. And for sure, that's the case with streaming services. The Herfindahl-Hirschman index, which is just a great name, it's sometimes called the HHI, so you don't have to learn how to spell it, is a slightly better version of the 4-firm concentration ratio. The reason I say slightly better is this, is that I could do a 4-firm concentration ratio, for example, with 2 types of companies, right? Imagine you had a market with just 2 companies. You had one that had 50% and another that had 50%. Well, their 4-firm concentration ratio would be 100. So you'd be like, well, that's pretty concentrated, right? But there'd be no way of telling the difference between that and a market like that, where one is 99% of the market and the other has 1%. It still ends up being the same 4-firm concentration ratio. So we would know it's really concentrated, but obviously there's a big difference between this first scenario where they're equal players and the second scenario where one just clearly dominates the other. And that's why the Herfindahl-Hirschman index is useful. It actually says sum the squares of the 4 largest firms' market shares. So in this case, it would be 20 squared plus 20 squared plus 15 squared plus 15 squared equals. Now, most of the time, the math is going to be a heck of a lot easier than on this one. And I totally blanked and forgot that I would need a calculator. So I'm going to pull my calculator out for this one. 20 squared, I can do obviously 20 times, right? 20 equals 400 plus 400 plus, and then we're going to do 15 times 15 equals 225. So plus 225. And so each of these is 625. So that ends up being 1250. Now, 1250 would be the ultimate HHI for these 4 companies. Now, with these 2, this is kind of an easier problem to wrap our heads around. You can see the HHI would be very different for these 2. 50 squared plus 50 squared Well, 50 squared is 2,500 plus 2,500 is 5,000. But 99 squared plus 1 squared, well, 99 squared, hopefully you can do that in your head, 9,801. And 1 squared is 1, so that's 9,802. And so it allows us, this HHI allows us to see that this number is so much bigger than 5,000, that clearly this market with 99% and 1% is almost twice as concentrated as the market where it's 50-50. And if we compared that to the one we just did with these real numbers, you can see that an HHI for the streaming market is pretty low actually compared to these. It's lower than 5,000 anyways. The theoretical maximum, what would be the maximum HHI, right, for any market? Well, it would be 100% of the market, 100% of the market in one firm. That would be a monopoly. And so 100 squared is equal to 10,000. So that would be a maximum value, and that would be a monopoly. So we know what a pure monopoly would look like. It would be an HHI of 10,000. Now, these types of firms, because they're interdependent, kind of going back to that beginning portion again here, we know that their outcomes are going to depend on what the other companies do. As a result of that, they're going to often try to avoid competing with each other. They're going to try to avoid getting in each other's ways. Now, one way that they can try to avoid competing is they can set up an explicit collusive agreement. Explicit means open, right? And not necessarily open to the authorities, but literally kind of sitting down and agreeing to not to not compete with each other. That's sometimes called formal collusion. They are forming what we call a cartel or a trust. So they're forming a cartel. They are creating a trust. If you've learned American history, sometimes we called them trusts back in the day. And it was basically agreements among these companies that they would actually avoid competing with each other. They would hold back their output and they would jack up prices. And when they're doing that, they're acting like a monopoly, right? So they're trying to act like a monopoly. In a moment, we'll talk about why that would be hard for them to do, but they sometimes do try. They also try to avoid competing with each other in informal ways, and we call this tacit or silent. Right? Tacit means kind of silent or taciturn, somebody who's kind of very reserved. And so a silent collusion or informal collusion is not illegal. In the United States, explicit or formal collusion forming cartels is illegal, but these methods are not. And that's pretty common actually among oligopolies. What they'll do is they'll still try to limit output and raise prices, but they won't openly communicate with each other. The first and easiest way they do it is they kind of look around the market. And they look at the market and they say, okay, who are the biggest players in the market? Netflix and Prime. And it's called price leadership because what will happen is one company, say Netflix, they'll start to raise prices. And what the other oligopolists will notice is if Netflix raises prices, what Prime can do is they can raise prices as well. Disney can raise prices, Hulu, HBO, they all raise prices just a little bit, and they all kind of keep the same amount of market share. If they all were to raise their prices by, say, $3 a month, then everybody kind of just looks around and goes, darn, these darn streaming companies, they all raise their prices. And they can do it without communicating because they kind of just wait for the biggest players in the market to do it. Netflix or Prime, if they raise the prices, the other companies will go, okay, yeah, we could do that too. So that's price leadership. And it happens all the time. Airlines do it. For example, 15 years ago, one airline said, we're going to start charging for checked bags. If you want to put a bag on the airplane and check it, you're going to have to pay $50. And within about a year, almost all the other airlines, just like magic, started doing that. It was price leadership. They didn't have to talk to each other. They just kind of waited and went, okay, we can all make more money if we just raise our prices, right? The second is through something called non-price competition or product differentiation. And what firms will do in that sense is they'll try to convince their own people that their product is really different from all the others, and they'll try to make it difficult for you to switch. An example of that: Android versus iPhone. They make it intentionally hard, Android and iPhone, to switch back and forth because they're actually trying to avoid competing with each other, right? Obviously, they would have more customers and that'd be a good idea, but Apple doesn't necessarily want to make it easy for you to switch over to Android, and Android users or Android providers don't necessarily want you to make it easy for you to switch from Android over to iPhone. You think the app stores don't even talk to each other. That's by design. It's not because it's too hard for them to do it. It's because they don't want you to switch. They're trying to avoid competing. Warranties and kind of customer loyalty programs. Sometimes you can hear about another form of it where they're kind of doing, where they're kind of trying to get you to stay within their ecosystem, right? Miles, if you talk about airline miles, those are another good example where they're kind of trying to keep you with their one company and they don't want you to switch. Another example of this kind of stuff is what we call strategic behavior. And this is the last way that they try to avoid competing with each other. They'll attempt to influence others' decisions, or they'll engage in this idea of, if I do this, then I know that the other company is likely to do that, because they know that they're interdependent. And we're going to study strategic behavior using a branch of math called game theory. And that'll be actually our second lecture. So we'll kind of talk about what that looks like in just the next lecture. Oligopolists, though, despite all these efforts, are still going to find it hard to collude. And that's fundamentally because, let's say they make a cartel or a trust and they behave like a monopolist. And let's say you have three companies. They all agree to restrict the amount of output and raise prices. Well, one company of those three, if they decide, you know what, let's cheat a little bit on this agreement. Let's produce a few more units and undercut the other two just a little bit. Well, when they do that, it brings the price in the market down, right? And that actually increases the profit for the company that cheats, because they're able to basically capture a larger share of the market at a lower price, and they get more customers. And the other two companies are like, wait a minute, we had an agreement. What are we doing? And then they're incentivized to get their prices cut as well, because they want to recapture those customers. We're going to do a simulation in class where we actually see that behavior play out. But what they will find it is that they kind of have an incentive to cheat on collusive agreements. In addition, there are other things that make it hard to collude. The larger number of firms, that would make it hard to collude, right? If you only have to keep track of one other competitor, then it's like, okay, if they cheat, I know they cheated. But if you have 8 competitors, it's a little bit harder, right? Price leadership doesn't happen as often if you have lots and lots and lots of competitors. But if you only have, say, 3 companies that provide the service, then price leadership starts to emerge pretty quickly. Complex product and pricing mechanisms make it hard for one company to know that the other company is cheating on a collusive agreement, right? So sometimes it can just be difficult if they've made this kind of a complicated network. If it's a simple price structure where it's like you buy one unit for this price, then it's relatively easy to spot when that one company cheats on the agreement, lowers their price a little bit, and captures a bunch of customers. But if it's really complicated, you can't tell. And this different cost structures also means that even when you have a collusive agreement and you're all earning profit, well, one company might be earning more profit than another, and that can kind of incentivize them to decide to make different choices, right? If you had, say, 3 companies in a market and they were in this kind of this agreement to raise prices and restrict output, and they're making lots of money, but only one of them is making tons of money, then and the other 2 are not, the other 2 are going to be like, dude, we should cheat and capture some of the profit from the big winner. And so that will often lead to less collusion as well. So this gives you the big overview of oligopoly. I hope it helped you understanding what the market structure is and how we can tell what it is using market measures. I'll see you next time.